Well, if people could gather back at the tables, we'd like to continue our program. It's my very special pleasure to introduce Dr. Francis Collins, the Director of the National Institutes of Health. I think most people know of Dr. Collins' work on the human genome. He's mapped probably more disease-related genes than just about anybody in the world, and he really was one of the forces behind genomics as we know it today. What I didn't know until recently was what an activist he was when he was at the NHGRI on minority and women issues, and he really had an influence on the development of the emphasis on broadening participation in science through the training grants, and I was quite excited to hear that. I also heard, I don't know if it's true, but that he was the cause of the paper that we were talking about earlier on race and funding, and that this part I think is true, he's appointed a task force to look at those results and try to figure out the basis and mechanisms to overcome them. So I think we really owe an enormous debt to Dr. Collins for increasing equity in science, and he's going to tell us his perspective on Rosalind Franklin in a very unusual presentation tonight.
Stand back. Well, thank you, Joe, and good evening to all of you. It's really a privilege to be able to come and speak to the Rosalind Franklin Society this evening and to say a few things about my perspective as NIH Director on the issues that I know you've been discussing today and will be discussing tomorrow in a really remarkable agenda in terms of the presenters and the topics that you're considering over the course of this day and a half. It's been said the discovery of DNA's structure had many fathers but only one mother, the unheralded Rosalind Franklin. Actually, that's a direct quote. It's from Bernadine Healy, my predecessor at NIH, a founding board member of the Rosalind Franklin Society, and the person who recruited me to NIH in 1993. I know you've heard about Bernadine from Bartlett, who spoke earlier in this meeting, and I wish I could have been here to hear that. We had a recent symposium at NIH to recognize Bernadine with many really, I think, inspiring comments from people who knew her in the many chapters of her many-chaptered life. I had the privilege of being part of that effort. Bernadine recruited me at a time where I really wasn't interested in becoming a federal employee. And that tells you something about the remarkable abilities of this leader of the NIH to encourage people to think big and to see a vision that maybe they hadn't seen quite yet. Because I was at the University of Michigan as a Howard Hughes investigator, running a laboratory, teaching medical students, which actually can be fun, and taking care of patients, and thought that that was my life's calling for the foreseeable. And Bernadine asked me to come and consider this job as the leader of the Human Genome Project after Jim Watson's rather sudden departure from the scene. And I said no, because it just didn't seem like this was the right thing for this particular guy to be doing. But I came back 3 months later after having turned this down, and I was there for a study section, and Bernie asked to see me, and I told this little story at the a memorial event we had for her, something that's burned into my brain as a really remarkable experience of seeing how a really good recruiter can handle a situation where it looks like it's not going well. So I came and I sat in her office at her request, and she again went through the arguments about why the Human Genome Project was going to be such a unique moment in history and what a great privilege it would be for somebody to lead that effort. And I had all my defenses prepared, and I was not going to be seduced into this particular conversation because I thought this was just not the job for me. And she stopped sort of midway through a sentence because I think she could tell it wasn't going well. And she said, "You know, darn it, I don't think I'm getting through to you. And I have this vision," Bernie said, "of both of us in a assisted living facility a few years from now, and I'm coming down the hallway with my walker, and you're coming down the hallway towards me with your walker. And we kind of come up next to each other, and then you turn and you look at me and you say, "Damn it, Bernie, I should have taken that job." Now, doesn't that sound like a bizarre recruiting ploy? But it was precisely in the spot that I was most vulnerable, because I had been wrestling with whether this was something I was going to regret for the rest of my life, giving up the chance to lead this enterprise. And she knew that. And she knew that with this sort of wake you up kind of little vision, that I wouldn't be able to just walk out of there saying nothing happened. So 2 days later, I said yes. And I've used that in recruiting ever since. I used it today, actually, with somebody I was trying to bring to a very important leadership position at NIH. I hope it worked. I don't know. We're going to find out in a day or two. I learned a lot from Bernie. And so it's wonderful to have a chance to reflect on that and to honor her, because we've, of course, lost her this year. Cancer took Bernie from us, just as it took Rosalind Franklin from us many years ago. And we've made a lot of understanding advances in cancer and our ability to control it, but not soon enough for her. So here we are in the 40th anniversary of the war on cancer. We have a ways to go. But I think just the same, we've all been privileged to have our lives touched by people like Bernie. And again, I'm delighted that Bartlett is here and has no doubt shared many thoughts about her with all of you earlier today. We've also made good progress in encouraging women researchers at NIH, but I think we're still far from reaching our goals. We do not have amongst us the kind of diversity, particularly in senior leadership, that would ensure the pioneering work of Rosalind Franklin to be recognized. So we have to do better. Recent studies have underscored the extent of the circumstance. The National Academies 5 years ago releasing their landmark study, Beyond Bias and Barriers, Fulfilling the Potential of Women in Academic Science and Engineering, a study that I look back at again in thinking about coming here this evening. And just this year, in a paper published in Academic Medicine with Vivian Penn as the senior author, NIH took a close look at the career paths of grantees and specifically looked at gender issues. As you all probably know from looking at that report, the good news is that success and funding rates for women and men were not significantly different in initial award programs. The not such good news is that for subsequent grants, application and funding rates were generally higher for men than for women, that there is clearly, as careers go forward, less of an equality between those numbers. And I think, again, that reflects we have a ways to go. And I think all of us familiar with what the circumstances are in academic medicine would look around at the leadership in terms of division chiefs, chairmen, deans, and so on, and say that while it is true in biomedical research, we seem to have achieved really remarkable steps in making this kind of opportunity available to women at the junior ranks, that at the senior ranks, we still have not made it happen. And one might be tempted to say, well, that's just going to take some time because those younger women scientists will need to mature into those roles. I don't think it's that simple. There are still clearly discouraging aspects of being a woman scientist that diminish one's chances, perhaps, of achieving those kinds of very senior leadership roles. And for the women who do find themselves on that path, from my observations, and I think this is documented in many ways, they find themselves pulled into a very long list of other committee responsibilities, all of which are meritorious and appropriate in terms of trying to serve as mentors, serve on search committees, try to make sure that important decisions within academia are appropriately influenced by senior women perspectives. But at the same time, the distractions that all of those can provide for someone who is still very active in their own scientific career aren't necessarily compatible with the most successful kinds of trajectories for women scientists. We are still short in terms of the ability to say we have achieved that kind of balance. So certainly for me, and I appreciate the positive comments that were made in the introduction about my own view here, I think this is a personal priority. We want to recruit and retain the best and brightest scientists of every generation, and we can't quite say we're doing that yet. We're doing better at recruiting women. We're not necessarily doing as well as we might in terms of retaining them. So what can we do about this? Well, I'm a fortunate inheritor of the legacy of others who have thought about these issues rather seriously. And in response to the National Academy report that I mentioned, Elias Zerhouni formed this NIH working group on women in biomedical careers. When I stepped into the role of NIH director in August of 2009, one of the tasks that I was assigned and embraced with enthusiasm was to co-chair that group, which I did with Vivian Penn. And I should stop right now and say Vivian Penn has been a phenomenal leader of this enterprise in her years as the director of the Office of Research on Women's Health, and somebody I've learned a lot from during my 18 years at NIH, and somebody whose leadership I miss now that she has retired from that role. And we had occasion to celebrate Vivian in several ways, but it could not have been enough for the ways in which she has contributed to the enterprise. And we do have a very vigorous search committee that has now been formed to search for the next director of the Office of Research on Women's Health. And the announcement of that will be forthcoming imminently. And I would encourage all of you to suggest ideas about who could step into some very significant shoes and take the ORWH on into the future for the many challenges that lie ahead, because I want that particular recruit to be one of the most electrifying kind of moments that you could imagine in terms of a leader that could move this enterprise forward. And you in the Rosalind Franklin Society, I suspect, will be particularly well situated to identify who the ideal candidates for that role would be. Because ORWH has a budget to support research, but also a very wide influence on the entire NIH in terms of specifically these issues of gender balance in research and women's ability to have successful biomedical research careers. One of the things that working group did, and I think you all are probably familiar with this, but just to go through where it stands, is to put out an actual RFA in 2008, grants funded in 2009, focused specifically on the causal factors and the interventions for women in scientific careers, to try to identify what are, in a rigorous analysis, the areas that are still getting in the way of the ability for women to have a successful trajectory in our scientific community. So in 2009, there were 14 grants funded in this particular RFA, support from 11 institutes and centers and 4 directors' offices contributed to that, including, in a very significant way, the Office of Research on Women's Health. Many different aspects of those 14 grants, and of course funded in 2009. They were 4-year grants. That means we're halfway through that effort. It's probably a little early to ask those principal investigators to say, what are your conclusions? But we're going to get there. We're going to get there pretty soon. One of my goals, once we have this new director of ORWH, which I hope will happen in the course of the next, say, 6 or 8 months, would be to think carefully about how best to highlight the outcomes of that set of grants, those 14, perhaps at a significant symposium, once again shining a bright light on what we have learned about the factors that play out in terms of women in scientific careers. So that's something to sort of pay close attention to, see how that's going to go. I think from what I've seen, and speaking to a couple of those principal investigators, this is going to be pretty interesting. And it has not previously been done in quite this way as a peer-reviewed research enterprise. In addition to that RFA, this particular group that now I co-chair with Janine Clayton, this working group on women in biomedical careers, has a number of other activities. In fact, quite a long list. When we get together, the diversity of efforts is pretty impressive. A lot of outreach activities, particularly running, for instance, a conference on best practices for sustaining career success, which had an interesting set of conclusions. This was a couple of years ago. There's also been the formation of a Women of Color in Biomedical Careers Committee, which is specifically focused on the dual challenges, I think, faced by women of color in our community, which traditionally has not been very well represented by folks from this particular community. Also, I think a lot of interest in this working group on mentoring. Certainly, if you are interested in seeing success of anyone in the scientific career trajectory, that mentoring step just cannot be overemphasized. And how do we actually set up programs that ensure that that happens? One that I want to mention, which is funded and has been by ORWH, is the Birch Program, Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health, BIRCWH. I guess it's a silent W. This has been in place now since 2000, so we're in the 11th year, which means we're starting to see real evidence of how it's working, and it's very impressive. This basically pairs junior faculty who've recently completed clinical or postdoctoral fellowships with senior investigators in the women's health field, again, providing an opportunity for mentoring in a very intentional way. Birch has sponsored over 450 junior faculty scholars at 39 academic centers in more than 25 states. And when you look now that this has been in place for 11 years, how has that worked? It turns out that Birch grantees, when they come back to NIH seeking independent grant support, do substantially better than the average applicant. So about 35% success rates in terms of research applications that come to NIH. And you may know that the current success rate is about half that. So I think that tells you that this is a program which has been quite successful in identifying and nurturing particularly individuals from diverse backgrounds, and the main focus is on women. Other things that I could mention this working group has focused on relates to the intramural program at NIH, because there's a place where we perhaps have both the greatest opportunity and the greatest responsibility to create a community that nurtures women scientists. And that has led to a number of new initiatives, which because we have the ability to set policies, we can just do so. That means extending the period of paid parental leave, extending the tenure clock for NIH scientists to accommodate family leave, establishing a program to enable investigators to hire a temporary lab manager while they're on extended leave, which is often an issue, implementing a leave bank, constructing additional child care centers. We have a new one that's coming online in 2012. Coming up with parenting connections, nursing mothers programs, and other features that we believe should be encouraging to women who are also in the process of raising families, that this is a family-friendly environment. I would not say it's perfect, but I would say we've made some real strides there. And this working group, which is primarily consisting of senior women leaders in the research community, have provided wonderful advice, and certainly, I think, from my perspective, the more of that, the better. So I think there's much we can point to in terms of initiatives and efforts and progress. What was mentioned in the introduction is something I also wanted to say something to you all about, because another area of diversity where we have done even less well is in encouraging individuals from traditionally underrepresented minority groups to join the scientific community. I think all of us looking around rooms full of our colleagues, including this one, would say we have not succeeded in making a scientific track sufficiently attractive to individuals, particularly African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. And we are woefully underrepresented when you look at the numbers of individuals who are now part of our biomedical research workforce. And I don't see this as a sort of affirmative action, social inspiration. I see this as we're missing out on talent that is going elsewhere and doing other things because our particular professional pathway is not seen as welcoming. And NIH has tried over many decades to try to do something about that. And I suspect things would be worse if we had not done so. Certainly many of those programs funded through NIGMS, and Jeremy Berg is here and could no doubt reflect on his own experience as having been a major leader in trying to improve the success of those enterprises in recruiting and retaining scientists from diverse backgrounds. But there's no question we have a ways to go. On top of that, NIH commissioned a study because of concerns to find out for those who do get into our workforce and then come forward to NIH with their first independent grant application, an R01, what does the success look like, and is there a difference depending on what group you're representing? And the answers were very troubling. And this paper published in Science back in August with Donna Ginther as the first author and Raynard Kington as the senior author, Raynard being the former acting director of NIH and deputy director of NIH, revealed data which is apparently also true of other agencies from what we have learned talking to our colleagues at NSF. The most disturbing part of this is that African American investigators fare less well in a statistically very significant way compared to whites. For instance, in this particular study over quite a few years, the success rate for a white applicant ran about 27%, for an African American applicant about 17%. I think the immediate reaction upon hearing that data is that people will go, oh, well, there's probably covariates that would explain that, just in terms of previous educational opportunities of the applicants themselves. And that doesn't do it. When you correct for all of those known variables, you still see about a 10-point difference. The only variable that turns out to be predictive of success for all groups, but particularly for minority groups, is previous service on a peer review panel, which is a very interesting conclusion because that does tell you also something that we could do in terms of an intervention. It kind of makes sense that if you have had the chance to see how peer review is conducted and what makes a successful grant and what goes down in flames, that your own chance of writing your own grant is likely to be improved. But most of the peer review processes at NIH don't ask people who've never been funded before to serve on those peer review panels. And maybe that's a mistake we've been making, particularly to try to give an opportunity for junior faculty to see exactly what goes on behind those doors. And that is something we have already instituted, is a program that specifically reaches out to traditionally underrepresented junior faculty, giving them an opportunity to serve on review panels, not in a very onerous way, but in a chance to see exactly how that is conducted. So seeing that data coming from the Ginther paper, I think anybody looking at that has to be deeply troubled. We imagine somehow, we in science, that we are truly colorblind, that we are socially very much attuned to the need of equality and justice, and yet the data doesn't support the outcome as defending that. What are the reasons for that? The Ginther paper basically proposed a model that this represents the effects of cumulative advantage that applies to the majority applicants, mostly white applicants, that they have along the way not just been able to be educated in distinguished institutions, because that matches between the groups, but also to participate in ways that are not easily recorded in networking, in mentoring experiences, in being part of the club, in being in a situation where before you send in that first grant, you have senior experienced investigators who look at it and give you some pointers about what might work and what might not. And maybe if you're not in the majority group, that's harder to come by, or the advice is not as reliable. This is their hypothesis, And it certainly seems plausible that some of that may be going on. But I think we have to take the other alternative also as a possibility, that there's actually bias in our system. And if there's bias, it might not just be on the basis of race and ethnicity. It might also be on the basis of gender. That's a difficult one to swallow. We don't like to think of that, of our community. And I guess I would have a hard time imagining that that's conscious bias. But if you think we have arrived at the point where we are completely free of unconscious biases, then look at the literature on this topic of unconscious bias, and you'll be very sobered by it. And there are even web-based programs that you can sign up for, and they're cited in the response that Larry Tabak and I wrote to the Ginther paper. I'd encourage you to have a look if you haven't done so. It will surprise you, even though you may think you're completely beyond any risks of that sort. Maybe not. Our society is still living with a legacy of centuries of inequalities, and I don't think just hoping that we're beyond that or claiming that we're beyond that necessarily means we totally are. Now, some would say, well, come on now, the study section doesn't actually know the racial or ethnic background of the applicant because there's no checkbox in what they are sent that tell them that. But it's not so hard to look at a CV and infer that, at least for some of the applicants. So I think we have to consider the possibility that there is still unconscious bias at work. And that means we need to do some experiments which are now getting underway, where we would actually strip off all the identifiers and run 2 parallel study sections, one of whom has the full information, the other of whom does not, and see what's the outcome there. What's the result? What's the difference? And is there then evidence that people are being influenced unconsciously by things that we would really not want to have part of the decision-making process? It's not going to be trivial to set these up, may I say, but it will be, I think, very important to do. So I want to tell you, certainly for myself and for Larry Tabak, my principal deputy, this is a very high priority to try to get to the bottom of this. We've also assembled a working group of my advisory committee and asked Reed Tuckson and John Ruffin and Larry Tabak to chair it to try to look at this issue of bias or in our system, or whatever explanation there might be for our problems in terms of diversity, both in recruitment and in then successful grant support to allow such talent to be retained in our midst. And we'll have to see how that goes. We just had our advisory committee meeting last week. They made a preliminary presentation of their plans. They aim to have something much more definitive to present by next June. So all is not well in our community, even though much is. And again, coming here to talk to the Rosalind Franklin Society, where you all have certainly looked with unflinching eyes at these issues, I thought it'd be appropriate to mention those as well. And while right now, I think our most glaring example where we do not seem to have achieved a completely welcoming community for all people is in the diversity area. It is certainly also true at some level in the gender differences that continue to deserve our attention. And certainly I would like to commit again to you that that is something that's going to be a very high priority as long as I am the NIH director. It would be easier, of course, to ignore those things. It would be easier if we had infinite resources to be able to put into all these efforts. It would be easier if the success rates for grant applications had not dropped to 17%, where everybody is under stress. We thought we might find out today what the mark is for FY12 for NIH, because it looks as if we are actually going to get an appropriation for this current fiscal year. And we might get it this week, but things got tangled up again on the Hill, as they tend to. And while the appropriators have arrived at a consensus between both parties in the House and the Senate about NIH, we don't know what it is. And we await maybe another 24 hours to find out what that number might be. I wouldn't get your hopes up that we're headed for double-digit increases or even single-digit increases. We'll be happy with flat. And that's a kind of sad thing to say when you consider the trajectory that we've been on for most of the last 40 years. But it is the circumstance we currently are living with. that has put our whole enterprise in a particularly difficult circumstance, and particularly that applies to how we support young scientists. And this is the thing that wakes me up at night and causes me the most concern. How are we going to keep our early stage investigators, with all of their creativity and their dreams and their talents, from getting discouraged when they have only one chance in 6 of getting funded when they come forward to us with their best and brightest ideas? We're going to do all kinds of creative things to try to keep that number from falling further, but there's no real magic here as long as the support dollars continue to dwindle. We are 20% down in terms of purchasing power of where we were in 2003, and the consequences of that are apparent to anybody who's running a lab depending on NIH. We are talking about some various levers that we might try to pull to keep that enterprise going. Should we, in fact, follow the lead of NIGMS, something that Jeremy instituted, and put a threshold in place for individual investigators who are very well funded and say, you know, if your total support gets above X dollars, and maybe X is $1.5 million, then we're going to look with great scrutiny to see whether that next application is really one that we think ought to be funded, considering that somebody else isn't going to get funded at all, who has no support and just missed the cut. But boy, I got to say, even though I think that might be an appropriate thing to do in difficult times, it does fly a little bit in the face of NIH's stance that we're a meritocracy and we're trying to support the best science. And when you put in other criteria, you have to worry about whether you're starting down a path, which ultimately we will regret. There's no magic here, as I said. There's no easy answers. It will certainly take the full commitment and the full-throated voice of the scientific community to explain what we do, why it matters, why the best hopes for the future of health depend on the research that NIH supports, and even, as I've frequently found myself doing, defending the fact that a dollar invested in NIH is one of the best investments you could make in the economy right now, because of the way in which this does result almost immediately in a more than twofold gain in goods and services in the local community. That's not something that I thought much about until a couple of years ago, but now one needs to do that. When I sat in a particularly important member's office this afternoon, he was not so interested in hearing about the promise of research for curing cancer and diabetes. He wanted to know why a dollar should be given to NIH when the deficit continues to grow. And the answer that seemed to get more traction with him was because that dollar is going to produce economic growth and jobs in your state, sir. And that's something that I think you really do care about. So we all have to be prepared for that. And I'm sure you think about those issues as well. Well, I don't want to go on indefinitely here. I do want to reassure you that from my perspective, the input of women in senior leadership roles is crucial for the future of NIH. Certainly as I put together my own close executive leadership team, Kathy Hudson, who's my Deputy Director for Science Outreach and Policy, one of the most important appointments I made, and somebody with great wisdom and great energy. When we put together council slates, I look at all of those before I approve them, and one of the things I first look at is, do we have good representation in terms of gender and race and ethnicity? When we put together symposia, I confess there have been times in the past we haven't done that very well, and the balance has not been good. And there tends to be sort of, call the same people who are often boys together. Let's not make those mistakes going forward. In terms of appointments, the 2 institute or center directors that I've had the privilege of appointing who are already in place, those being the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research and the Center for Information Technology, are both women. I have a couple of other recruitments in process, and from my perspective, we have wonderful women in leadership positions at NIH, and the more the better. And again, I wish there were more candidates out there that I could chase after. So I am very much, I think, aligned with the goals of the Rosalind Franklin Society. By the way, I did look back, and I don't know if you know this, Rosalind Franklin was an NIH grantee. she submitted a grant in 1957, just shortly before her death, and received an award. That award ultimately was transferred to Aaron Klug, her mentor at the time of her death, and he continued to carry out the research, but she was the person who wrote the grant, and we supported it. So there's a little connection there. Well, again, I know you all have already had a full day. Last spring, I had the pleasure of attending Anna Ziegler's Photograph 51, and I think you'll hear from Anna tomorrow, this play describing the events of 1952, 1953. And that was really quite a remarkable performance and a remarkable work that Anna has put together. I was asked at the end of the performance to engage in a panel discussion, which was interesting. And one of the things that came up at the end was sort of one's own personal views of Rosalind Franklin. And I, in the process of talking about that, revealed something that has led to the coda to my little presentation this evening, which is that Rosalind also has a special place in my life. In fact, Rosalind came with me this evening. So, let me tell you this story. When I had finished my 16 years as the director of the Genome Institute, the wonderfully generous people who worked there took up a collection and volunteered to help me design a guitar that I could have as a memento of the experience, because that seemed like something I would like, and boy, they were right about that. So this guitar was actually custom made by a luthier in my hometown of Stanton, Virginia, called Husson Dalton, and I got to pick out the wood. The front here is Adirondack spruce, the sides are Indian rosewood, and of course there is a little bit of vanity on the fretboard, which is the double helix in mother of pearl. And of course the guitar had to have a name. B.B. King had Lucille, so I had to have some way of recognizing this guitar is different than all others. And I actually held a little contest of the folks who worked at the Genome Institute to suggest names. And I knew what I hoped it would be, but I wanted to make this a democratic event. Well, interestingly, there were about 160 names suggested. 13 of them were the same name, and it was the one I picked. And of course, it's Rosalind. Rosalind for Rosalind Franklin, who, of course, the double helix is represented here on the fretboard and associated with the names of Watson and Crick. Watson and Crick never would have gotten there without Photograph 51 and all of the other important, incredible work done by Rosalind. So whenever I pick this up, I remember that and think of her and the need to try to recognize those who do the work and make sure that they are given the credit they deserve. So somebody asked, well, maybe you should bring Rosalind along. So here she is, and maybe you should even have a song. Now, I have to tell you, some of the people I know pretty well said, you're going to destroy the dignity of the occasion if you go through with that particular recommendation, and maybe you should just politely decline. But here we are, and I guess it's too late to decide I'm not going to do this now, so maybe we'll try this. And trying to think about what kind of a song to sing on an occasion like this. It certainly should not be a silly song, so this is not. Instead, I borrowed a song from a folk singer that I'm very fond of, because my father was a folk song collector, and so I always had the chance through my parents to get to know people in this community. And this folk singer, somebody I heard sing this song a couple of months ago at a folk festival, Carrie Newcomer. And the song is very much an evocative one about having reached a point where you can see the possibilities, but they haven't quite been realized yet. It seems to me that's what this society stands for. You can see the possibilities for much more in the way of an embracing career path for women and diverse individuals in this remarkable adventure we're all part of. But it hasn't quite happened yet. So are we going to wait another century, or what's going to happen? Well, the song says, if not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. So I wouldn't mind if you actually helped me out with the chorus. And this is the chorus. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. I see sorrow and trouble in this land. I see sorrow and trouble in this land. Although there will be struggle, we'll make the change we can. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. It will take a change of heart for this to mend. It will take a change of heart for this to mend. But miracles do happen, every shining now and then. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. So we'll work until it's done. Every daughter, every son, every soul that ever longed for something better, something brighter. All together now, there's nothing we can't do. All together now, there's nothing we can't do. No, sometimes we grow weary, love and hope will see us through. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. In this struggle, count me as your friend. In this struggle, count me as your friend. Then all of us together can follow Rosalind. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. That's it. Marion.
When you talk about disparity in underserved populations, have you looked at all to see how that translates from biology majors up? I mean, in college, undergraduate biology, do you see the same discrepancies there? Because these are the people who are going to apply to grad school, et cetera.
So what we see is clearly that those transition points are where we lose people from diverse backgrounds. That you can see early on in K through 12 a fair amount of interest in science, biology, and other types across the board. But then as you go from high school to college, you lose people. When you go from college to graduate school, you lose people. The pipeline is very leaky for individuals from non-traditional backgrounds, which, again, I think reflects lack of role models, lack of mentoring, lack of a supportive community. And while we probably can't fix all the way back to the beginning there in terms of what goes on in K through 12, we're determined to focus on some of the things that happen after that, because we're losing a lot of the talent along the way, because apparently people coming into our community don't see this as a welcoming experience if they're not part of the majority group. Yeah.
The place where the real problem is, as I see it and what you've said tonight, is the young investigator gets that first grant, and I realize there's already diversity problems at that level.
Yeah.
But let's just say they get that first grant, they can't get it renewed. What efforts are being done to try to smooth that transition? Because we already have the first grant at age 42.
Right.
And then, you know, if they don't get, we're going to lose a whole generation in there.
And it's a problem all the way along, because, of course, if they don't get the first grant, then we've lost before he even got started as an independent investigator. This is the tricky balance. Right now, what NIH does is we take those individuals who've never previously received an NIH grant, who come in, go through peer review. They get put in a pool where the other people in the pool are like them. They are previously unfunded new applicants. So they're competing against each other and not against very established investigators with long track records. That helps a bit, because at least then their success rates are equivalent. But what about then that next comeback? Because that's a critical point. Are you going to get that first renewal or not? At the moment, we don't have sort of special pools to put those individuals in. Right. If you don't get that renewal, or even in some institutions, if you don't have 2 R1s by then your tenure is at risk. Again, those situations are all made so much worse by the fact that funding is so tight. And even as we try to do things to help young investigators, I get more and more letters from established investigators saying, hey, you're going too far here, that you are disrupting the meritocracy by putting other factors in there. I don't happen to agree with that. You know, we just started a new program. In fact, the symposium, I think, might be in the next day or so, with the first awardees, trying to, for very talented young investigators who are really not going to benefit from a long postdoc, or maybe any postdoc at all, to have them go directly from doctoral degree to an independent position with mentoring. So this is the Early Independence Award, modeled a bit after the Whitehead or the Cold Spring Harbor or UCSF or Carnegie. They all have programs like this. We tried to learn from those. The first 10 awardees are about to get launched. And that's one other way to try to deal with the very, very prolonged training periods that most individuals go through. I should tell you one other thing we're doing. I asked Shirley Tillman, who's on my advisory committee to the director, to lead an effort to look at the biomedical research workforce in a very broad way. Because I, in any given week, have people telling me, you're not training enough PhDs for the needs of the scientific community. And somebody else saying, you're training way too many PhDs because there's no place for them to go, because faculty slots are hard to come by. Well, obviously, part of the answer to that latter question is, hey, we're not just about faculty slots. One thing that we have done, I think, that's been a disservice to trainees is to suggest that the only real success story in terms of your career path is to be a tenure-track faculty member in a top-tier university. And that's not helping, I think, a circumstance where there are many other potential pathways that are also scientifically rewarding and exciting. We call those alternative pathways, don't we? Which immediately says, well, they're second rate, or at least that's what people hear. And when they're being mentored, usually by tenured or tenure-track faculty, it's natural to think, well, that's what I should be too. This has got to change. So Shirley and Sally Rocky, who's the director of extramural research as the co-chair, are trying to do something pretty radical here, which is to model the workforce. What are all the outputs that we're trying to meet in terms of academia, in terms of industry, in terms of other paths and policy, journalism, teaching, and what are the current inputs in terms of interest in coming into this field, both domestic and international? And could we put together a reasonably accurate depiction of that and then feed the data and see where are we here? It's not that NIH has complete control over this because we only support about a third of graduate students as trainees. The 2/3 are on people's grants. But we have a pretty good lever there that we could work on. And it's not just about quantity, it's also about quality. Should every graduate student have a chance to try out some other pathways as part of their rotation, spend a little time in a biotech company or in a policy shop to see what those things are like as opposed to being tied to the bench? Well, maybe. So this is a big task. Shirley, I think, is both excited about doing this and a little daunted. We had their first report on progress last week, and they are charged with coming up with some specific recommendations by next June. And as part of that charge, very much ask them to look at gender issues as well. So this is going to be interesting.
Sorry, one more question. And this is a little bit of a tricky question. The upper end of the echelon, the older investigators who are very good and very established investigators, that age curve is moving up. So grants are being funded well into the 70s.
Yep.
And getting close to age 80 to get a grant funded. And I realize that some of these people still have very, very good ideas, but with limited funding, has NIH thought about what they could do? I realize age discrimination, I'm old, I can say this. Age discrimination's not allowed. Nevertheless, this might be blocking some of the younger people.
The statistics are, yes, a source of some concern. We fund more principal investigators over 70 than under 30.
Yes.
And people
that's a problem.
Looking at that would say, wait a minute, what's happened there? Because certainly the general sense is, although maybe it's less true of biology than it is of mathematics and physics, but the general sense is that people do a lot of their really creative work at earlier stages than we are currently choosing to make people independent. It is, though, very hard to imagine interceding in what we continue to believe ought to be a meritocracy and telling a very highly productive, still vigorous investigator that they've sort of passed some age threshold and are about to get looked at with greater scrutiny. But it is. You're right.
You need something innovative, I think.
Sorry?
You need something innovative, I think, to deal with these people.
Wouldn't it be possible to request more of those senior PIs to actually take on the role of, as part of their award in their later years, to do more mentoring, yeah, or to work someone else or collaborate equally with someone to bring them into that position? And ultimately take their place.
That's fair, assuming they're good mentors, and you want to be sure of that.
Maybe, that's another reason.
One thing that I think we have been pushing a lot harder is to make it an expectation of senior scientists that they are going to serve on peer review panels and not say, I'm too busy, because that's a critical part of your participation in the community. There's a question back here.
A very big project, very expensive, huge project versus individual on one.
I guess it would depend on what you set as the threshold. Probably less than most people would think. The big projects tend to get visible attention. Most of them are community resource projects that are supposed to be making data available to empower other people as well. 51% of the NIH budget currently goes to individual R01s, which are investigator-initiated, mostly modest in scale, although there are some large R01s as well for clinical trials, for instance. So the kinds of things that you might be thinking of, many of which are genome connected, things like the ENCODE project or the 1,000 Genomes project, all told, don't add up to a very significant percentage. We do insist that projects of that sort have to adhere to a very high standard of data release, as we did for the Genome Project, because if you're going to get all that money to generate those kinds of resources, there's no justification for keeping them hidden. As soon as you've got the data in a fashion where the quality is acceptable, then it's got to be made available.
Has gender distribution or minority involvement in those grants been looked at? Is there a difference there compared to R01s? Sometimes I get the feeling that with our data that it's a little bit a club that forms a consortium that can apply for such a large grant.
I don't know the data for gender or diversity. Certainly my own experience in the genome arena, yeah, there may be a club, but it's a reasonably balanced club gender-wise. Certainly any consortium that's going to come together and ask for a big amount of money tends to be people who've already decided they want to work together, and that's oftentimes a good thing. It would be interesting to look and see. If we picked out the largest grants, what does the gender distribution look like, and is it different than what you see in other places? We could do that.
Having reviewed a number of research centers of excellence in the bioterror, biodefense area, it's almost, I would bet.
I think we need.
And bioterror.
Okay. Carla's giving me the word that we need to let you go back to your other job, but we want to thank you for a marvelous, marvelous evening.
Well, thank you all. It's great to be with you.